My life felt like a scene from a movie. I had a loving wife, intelligent, caring, and always by my side, no matter the circumstances. We laughed together, overcame challenges together, and dreamed of our future together. Every day, I thank my lucky stars for having her in my life. Our home, built with care and love, was a testament to our bond, and I considered her not just my partner, but also my best friend. She was the one person I could trust with my deepest thoughts and secrets. My brother was the second most important person in my life. We grew up together, sharing the joys and sorrows of childhood. Even as adults, our bond remained unbreakable. He was my rock, and I took pride in knowing he was always there for me. We often spent time together, helping each other with everything from mundane chores to major life decisions. Our evenings were filled with joy. My brother often joined us for dinner, and the three of us would sit together, joking and sharing plans for the future. I sometimes joked that he had become an honorary member of our little family. His humor and sincerity brought an ease to our gatherings, and every time I watched my wife and brother laugh together, I thought, I'm lucky. I have everything I could ever need for a happy life. When you have relationships like these, with a devoted wife and a supportive brother, you start to believe your world is strong and unbreakable. I felt secure in this circle of love and trust. It never crossed my mind that this harmony could be fragile, that behind the smiles and warm words, something deeper might be brewing. I saw no cracks in this perfect picture, but life has a strange way of opening our eyes to truths we don't want to see. At that moment, I didn't realize that everything I believed in would soon collapse like a house of cards. Sometimes, we're so blinded by our confidence that we fail to notice the signs life places before us. Sometimes, even those closest to us can change our world in ways we never imagined. This was just the beginning of the story. At that point, I was convinced my world was perfect, that my trust in them was unshakable. I couldn't have imagined how painful the fall that awaited me would be. I had always valued my close relationship with my brother. He could come to our house anytime, and that was normal. Our home was always open to him. But over time, I started noticing that he visited more frequently than usual. At first, it seemed innocent. I thought, maybe he just needs some company. He's going through a rough patch. But something changed. He started showing up at times when I wasn't home or visiting late at night after dinner. It stirred a small sense of unease, but I dismissed it. It's my brother, I told myself. He's always been there for me. There's nothing strange about him visiting often. Then I began noticing small things that were harder to ignore. Every time he visited, he seemed to help my wife more than necessary. If she was chopping something in the kitchen, he was right there beside her, offering suggestions or making jokes. If something needed to be carried or fixed, he'd jump at the opportunity to be the hero of the day. His support seemed overly enthusiastic, and her gratitude just a bit too effusive. There was a strange energy between them, something I couldn't quite explain. Their glances lingered a moment too long. These weren't the casual exchanges of friends. They carried something deeper. One evening in particular stands out in my memory. We were sitting on the couch after dinner. I was sharing a story from work, but instead of paying attention to me, my brother was looking at my wife. She returned his gaze with a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. The air in the room felt charged with an invisible tension I couldn't understand. Her laughter changed as well. She still laughed at his jokes like we all did, but now her laughter sounded too genuine, too delighted. It wasn't the kind of laughter you could brush off. It carried a warmth and emotion that hadn't been there before. Each time I heard it, I felt a growing unease, something akin to jealousy, but not quite. It was a warning bell that I tried desperately to ignore. I started recalling how they interacted in the past, and I realized their dynamic had shifted. What once was lighthearted and carefree had become deeper, more intimate. Their jokes now seemed to have layers I didn't understand. Their laughter often stemmed from things that left me feeling excluded. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. You're overthinking it. They get along well. It's normal for your wife and brother to have a good relationship, I told myself. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the harder it became to believe. It felt like I was losing touch with reality, no longer understanding what was happening in my own home. One day, while working from home, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were hushed, and I could barely make out the words. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that they shared some kind of secret they didn't want me to know. That was the moment when the warning bells in my head turned into deafening alarms. Yet even then, I couldn't fully believe it. Could I imagine something like this happening? No, it seemed absurd to me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was definitely something between them. But what exactly? And was I truly ready to find out the truth? I had always thought I knew my wife down to the smallest details. Her habits, her moods, her behaviors. I knew them all so well that I could tell what she was thinking just by looking at her. But recently, everything had started to change. At first, it was little things, so small they were easy to miss. But over time, those little things began to grow into something much bigger. The phone. It used to be just another item in the house, left on the table or the nightstand, unattended, even when others were in the room. But now, it was practically an extension of her hand. She kept it close at all times, in her pocket, in her hand, even during dinner. If it buzzed or rang, she'd quickly pick it up, glance at the screen, and either respond or silence it. I began to notice how often she postponed conversations if I was nearby. Her fingers would glide swiftly over the screen, and then she'd glance over to see if I was watching. It was odd because we used to laugh together at her friend's silly texts. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie when her phone vibrated. Her expression shifted immediately. She didn't answer right away, but soon excused herself, saying she needed to use the bathroom, taking her phone with her. I sat there, trying not to think too much about it, but these little moments started forming a pattern I didn't like. Her behavior had changed too. She avoided long conversations with me. We used to spend hours talking, sharing plans, laughing at silly things, reminiscing about our past. Now, her answers were short, as though she wanted to end the discussion quickly. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, she'd brush it off, saying she was just tired and needed some space. She began retreating to our bedroom more often, claiming she wanted to read or watch something on her phone. One night, I decided to surprise her by making dinner. I lit candles, played her favorite music, and set the table, hoping to have a quiet evening together. But when I knocked on the bedroom door, she opened it looking flustered. "I'm really tired tonight," she said, glancing quickly at her phone lying on the bed. "Maybe we can do this another time?" Her words sounded sincere, but something felt off. She had never turned down an evening together before, and I couldn't understand what had changed. Her tiredness had become an excuse for everything. If I suggested going for a walk, she said she needed rest. If I proposed watching a movie, she wasn't in the mood. We started spending less and less time together, and it became a source of constant anxiety for me. Then there was her sudden need for personal space. She used to share everything with me, her thoughts, her work problems, even her dreams. Now, when I tried to ask what was on her mind, she'd shrug it off. "Everything's fine," she'd say, but her voice felt distant. Instead of confiding in me, she seemed to keep everything to herself. I noticed how she would spend evenings in our bedroom. She'd say she was reading, but whenever I walked in, she would quickly close her phone or change the subject. Her smile, once warm and genuine, now felt forced, as if she was hiding something. I began questioning myself. Was this all in my head? Was I being paranoid? Maybe she really was just going through a tough time? But the more I observed, the more I felt that the growing distance between us wasn't accidental. It was like an invisible wall she had built, and I couldn't figure out how to break it down. My heart ached. What had happened to our relationship? What had I done wrong? And why was I starting to feel like I didn't recognize the person I once thought I knew so well? It was an ordinary evening, nothing special. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, flipping through TV channels, trying to distract myself from my restless thoughts. She was in the kitchen making tea. Everything seemed normal, but inside me, something felt off. It was that strange instinct you can't explain. Everything seems fine, but you just know something isn't right. Suddenly, her phone, left on the table nearby, started buzzing. At first, I didn't pay much attention, but the vibration caught my eye. I glanced over and saw my brother's name flashing on the screen. My heart skipped a beat. Why was he calling her? And why at this hour? This wasn't a casual work call or a friendly check-in. It felt like something more. My first instinct was to ask her directly, but I stopped myself. She came back from the kitchen, and I noticed how her eyes immediately locked onto the phone. Her face shifted subtly. There was a flicker in her eyes, not warm or happy, but anxious. Almost like she knew I'd seen the name on the screen. "Oh, it's just my brother," she said casually, as if it didn't matter. But I noticed how quickly she grabbed the phone and left the room without waiting for my response. She closed the bedroom door, not all the way, but just enough to make it clear she wanted privacy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up from the couch, trying to move quietly. My heart was pounding so loudly, it felt like it could drown out any sound around me. I approached the slightly ajar door, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I managed to catch a few words that made my stomach drop. "No, he doesn't know. We just have to be careful," she said. Her words were clear, but their meaning was hazy. Who didn't know? What did they have to be careful about? I stood there, trying to process whether I had heard her correctly. My mind was already racing with the worst scenarios, but I refused to believe it. My world, which once felt so solid and secure, was beginning to crack. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what lay beyond those cracks. That night, as the house sat in eerie silence, I carefully installed the hidden camera. My hands trembled as I positioned it on a shelf amidst books no one had touched in years. The lens had a clear view of the living room, the very space where they spent so much time together. It felt wrong, invasive even, but I knew I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty, with my heart constantly pounding and my thoughts spiraling. As I finished setting it up, I tested the feed on my phone. The live image of our cozy living room appeared on the screen. It looked so normal, so peaceful, yet I knew the truth might not match the illusion. I turned off the app, slid the camera further into the shadows, and stepped back, staring at it for a long moment. This is it, I thought. This will either destroy me or set me free. The next few days were a haze of nerves and paranoia. Every time they were in the living room together, I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket, knowing I could open the app and watch. But I forced myself to wait. I didn't want to act impulsively or misinterpret something innocent. I needed undeniable proof, clear, irrefutable evidence. Then came the night I'd been dreading. I told my wife I had a late meeting at work, but instead I parked a few blocks away from the house. From my car, I opened the app and watched. My heart raced as the feed came to life. There they were. My wife and my brother sat together on the couch, a bottle of wine between them. At first, their conversation seemed casual, innocent even. They laughed about something, their voices blending with the background noise of the TV. But as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. Their body language changed. She leaned closer to him, her hand brushing against his arm as she laughed. He didn't pull away. I could feel my chest tightening as I watched their movements. It wasn't blatant, but it was there. The small touches, the lingering glances, the kind of comfort that spoke of something deeper. Then came the moment that shattered everything. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," my wife said softly, her voice barely audible over the app's feed. My brother looked at her, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. "We just have to be careful," he replied. "He doesn't suspect anything yet." My world stopped. Those words hit me like a freight train. He doesn't suspect anything yet. They were talking about me. They were hiding something, and now I had the confirmation I dreaded. I sat frozen in my car, staring at the screen, replaying their words in my mind. My stomach churned, and my hands gripped the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The truth I had been seeking was right there, staring back at me, and it was worse than I could have imagined. For a moment, I considered storming into the house, confronting them right then and there. But something stopped me. I needed to process this. I needed to figure out my next move. So I closed the app, turned off my phone, and sat in silence, trying to breathe through the storm of emotions consuming me. When I finally returned home later that night, the house was quiet. My wife was already in bed, her breathing steady, as if nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at her peaceful face, wondering how she could lie so easily, how she could sleep so soundly while I was unraveling. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. The time for doubts and suspicions was over. It was time for the truth, no matter how painful it would be. As I sipped my coffee, watching her move around the kitchen as if everything was normal, I made my decision. "Can we talk?" I said, my voice steady but firm. She froze for a moment, her back to me, before turning around with a forced smile. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I set my mug down, looking her directly in the eyes. "I know about you and him. I know everything." Her smile faltered, and her face paled. The silence between us was deafening, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. The weight of betrayal settled heavily in my chest as I sat in silence, staring at the now blank screen. My world, once filled with love and trust, had been shattered in mere moments. Everything I thought I knew about my wife and brother had been turned upside down. The people I held closest had conspired against me in the most intimate way possible, and now I was left with nothing but the truth, raw, painful, and undeniable. For a while, I couldn't move. My body felt like lead, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of emotions. Rage, sorrow, humiliation, they all collided, fighting for dominance as I replayed their words, their actions, over and over in my mind. The betrayal wasn't just in what they had done. It was in the lies they'd told, the secrets they'd kept, and the way they continued to live under the same roof with me, as if everything was normal. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I struggled to keep my emotions in check. A part of me wanted to storm into the house, to confront them both immediately, to unleash all the pain and fury that was boiling inside me. But another part of me held back. I knew I needed to approach this carefully. I needed to stay in control, even when everything else was falling apart. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I avoided my wife, giving her excuses about being busy or needing some time alone. Every time she spoke to me, her voice filled with that familiar warmth I once cherished, I felt a pang of bitterness. How could she act so normal? How could she pretend that everything was fine while hiding such a terrible secret? And my brother, every memory of our shared childhood, every moment of trust, now felt like a cruel joke. That evening, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, knowing what I knew and doing nothing about it. I needed answers. I needed to hear the truth from their lips, no matter how painful it would be. And so, I prepared myself for the confrontation. The next day, I invited my brother over under the guise of a casual chat. My wife didn't suspect anything, and she went out to run errands, leaving us alone in the house. It was the perfect opportunity, and I wasn't going to waste it. When he arrived, his usual carefree demeanor grated on my nerves. He sat on the couch, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I stood across from him, my arms crossed, trying to keep my composure. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. He looked up at me, confused. "Sure, what's up?" I didn't waste time beating around the bush. "I know about you and her," I said bluntly, my gaze piercing into him. His expression changed instantly. The easy smile faded, replaced by a mix of shock and guilt. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to feign ignorance. "Don't play dumb," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "I've seen the recordings. I know what's been happening behind my back." For a moment, he said nothing. His face went pale, and his hands fidgeted nervously. Finally, he sighed and lowered his head. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I pressed, my anger bubbling to the surface. "To betray your own brother? To destroy my marriage? To sit in my house, eating my food and smiling in my face while you—" "I'm sorry," he interrupted, his voice desperate. "I know I messed up. I know I betrayed you. But it wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how was it supposed to be?" I shot back, my voice trembling with emotion. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you didn't think about me at all." He looked at me with pleading eyes, but I couldn't find any sympathy for him. "It just happened," he said weakly. "We didn't plan for it, I swear. But we got close, and one thing led to another." I shook my head, disbelief and disgust coursing through me. "You got close? You mean you crossed every boundary of decency and trust? How long has this been going on?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "A few months," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "A few months," I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "All this time, you looked me in the eye and pretended to be my brother. How could you do this to me?" Before he could respond, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My wife had returned. I turned toward the doorway as she walked in, her cheerful expression faltering the moment she saw us. She must have sensed the tension in the room because her smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and unease. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. I looked at her, then at my brother, and took a deep breath. "Sit down," I said, my voice firm. "We're going to talk about the truth, and I want to hear it from both of you." Her face paled, and I saw the same guilt in her eyes that I'd seen in his. For the first time, they both looked genuinely afraid. Afraid of the truth that was finally coming to light. And I was ready to hear it all, no matter how much it would hurt. The next evening, I returned home, my heart heavy with the weight of the inevitable. I could no longer live with this knowledge, keeping it all inside and pretending that nothing had happened. All the suspicions, doubts, and fears were now in the past. I had facts now. I knew the truth, and I needed answers. When I opened the door, I was met with the familiar silence of the house. But this time, it felt different, heavy, suffocating. In the living room sat the two people I had once loved most in my life. My wife and my brother. They were sitting together on the couch, and though their conversation stopped when I entered, the tension between them was obvious. Their faces changed immediately when they saw me. Her smile disappeared, and his confident demeanor suddenly became tense. I set my keys on the table and, without saying a word, slowly walked toward them. My heart pounded so loudly I could almost hear it. Stopping a few steps away, I looked directly at them. Their eyes avoided mine, as if they knew I was about to speak. "What's going on between you two?" My words cut through the silence like a blade. She flinched, her hands nervously clutching the fabric of her dress. My brother furrowed his brow, as if trying to gather his thoughts to respond. But they both stayed silent. That silence only fueled my anger. I know something is going on, I continued, not raising my voice, but the force of my words made her shudder. And this time, I want to hear the truth. No stories. No excuses. Just the truth. You've got it all wrong, my brother suddenly said, trying to keep his tone calm. But there was panic in his voice. There's nothing between us. Nothing. I stepped closer, leaning toward him. Then how do you explain what I saw on the recording? How do you explain your hugs? Your conversations about being careful? How? Their faces turned pale. She looked at me with wide eyes, like a deer caught in headlights. He lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. I don't know what to say, she whispered, barely holding back tears. It was a mistake. A mistake. My voice suddenly rose. A mistake is when you accidentally do something wrong. But what I saw, that wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. Both of you made a deliberate choice to betray me. It's not what you think. My brother began, but I cut him off. Not what I think. I laughed bitterly. Then tell me, what was it? Explain to me why you were sitting with my wife in my bedroom, why you were holding hands, why you were discussing how to keep this from me. She burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. My brother looked lost, as if he didn't know how to defend himself. It wasn't that simple, she finally said, lowering her hands from her face. I don't know how it happened. I was lonely, you were busy, and he was just there. Just there? I struggled to keep my composure. You're justifying betrayal by saying I was working to provide for us? That I trusted you and believed you were my partner, not someone who would cheat behind my back. My brother finally raised his head and tried to speak. I know we made a terrible mistake, he said quietly. But it wasn't supposed to go this far. We didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me? I interrupted him. Are you serious? You knew what you were doing, and every time you kept it a secret, you made a choice. You both chose to hurt me. I couldn't look at them any longer. Their excuses, their tears, their words, it was all poison, eating me from the inside out. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of myself. I don't want to hear any more of this, I finally said. You both knew what you were doing, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them in silence. But that silence brought me no peace. It only highlighted the chaos left in my heart. I sat in the same room where I had recently endured the greatest blow of my life. My wife and my brother, two people I had trusted unconditionally, sat in front of me. Their faces were pale, their eyes filled with shame and fear. But those expressions changed nothing. They couldn't erase the chasm that had suddenly formed between us. I gathered all my strength not to give in to anger and said, Fine, I want to hear your explanations. You have a chance to tell the truth. Let's start with you, I said, looking at her. She lifted her tear-streaked eyes to meet mine. Her lips trembled, and her voice was barely audible. I don't know where to start, she said, wiping tears from her face. I know nothing I say will justify what I've done, but I felt so lonely when you weren't around. You were always busy with work, and I was left alone. I didn't even realize how it happened. He was just there. Just there? I barely restrained myself. Do you even understand how that sounds? You're saying loneliness is an excuse for betrayal? Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me you were struggling? Is this how problems in our marriage are solved? She lowered her head, unable to find the words. I could see her shoulders trembling, but I had no compassion left. I shifted my gaze to my brother. Now it's your turn. I want to hear what excuse you have. He looked even more nervous than she did. His hands were clenched into fists, and his eyes avoided mine. Finally, he spoke. Listen, I know this looks terrible, and I never wanted it to go this far. But he paused, as if trying to summon the courage. I fell in love with her. I didn't plan for it, but it happened. I know it's wrong. I know I betrayed you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. In love. The words cut through me like a blade. You fell in love with my wife? Do you even realize what you're saying? You were like a brother to me. You were part of my family. How could you do this to me? His head dropped even lower. He said nothing, and I felt my world crumbling into pieces. This was more than I could bear. The people I trusted the most turned out to be the ones who betrayed me the worst. You both have been destroying my life without even thinking about what it means to me, I said, looking from her to him. You played with my feelings, with my trust, and now you're just sitting here crying? We didn't want to hurt you, she finally said through her tears. I know we made a terrible mistake, but I love you. I want to fix this. Please give us a chance to make it right. Her words sounded hollow, like an empty echo. How could you fix something that had already been shattered into pieces? How could I forget what I saw and trust them again? At that moment, I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was the destruction of everything I held sacred. I stood up, slowly and heavily. Their eyes lifted to meet mine, but I couldn't look at them anymore. I can't listen to this anymore, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I trusted you both. I opened my heart, my life to you, and you destroyed it. Now I need to figure out how to move forward. But one thing I know for sure, I can't stay here with you. I walked toward the door, leaving them in silence. I couldn't bear to look at them anymore or hear their excuses. My soul was shattered, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a painful journey where I would need to find myself and decide how to move on. For several days, I was lost in deep reflection. Honestly, those were the darkest days of my life. I sat in an empty house, trying to comprehend how this could have happened. It felt like time had stopped. Every room, every object in that house reminded me of what had been destroyed. The same questions kept spinning in my head. Why? How could they do this to me? What did I do wrong? I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. The person I saw was a broken version of who I once was. My heart felt hollow, and my mind was overwhelmed with pain. But through that darkness, I realized one important thing. Staying around these people meant living in constant pain. And if I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to make a hard but necessary choice. That evening, I called her into the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from endless crying, but I no longer felt sympathy. I mustered the courage and said, "You need to pack your things and leave. We no longer have a future together." Her face froze. She started crying, begging me to give her a chance. "Please, we can fix this. I made a mistake, but I love you." I looked her straight in the eyes and calmly but firmly replied, "Love? Is that what you call love? Love isn't betrayal. It isn't lies. Love doesn't destroy, it builds. What you did was destruction. I can't live with you anymore. Every time I look at you, I see lies, and I don't want to live with those lies." She cried even harder, but I stood firm. I couldn't let her keep me in this state any longer. After that, I decided to take the next step. I called my brother. His voice was tense when he picked up the phone. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to sound confident, but I could hear his nervousness. "I want you to know, we're no longer brothers. You destroyed everything that connected us. Don't look for me. Don't call me. Don't try to justify yourself. For me, you no longer exist." He tried to say something, but I hung up. I deleted his number and blocked every way he could contact me. After they were both out of my life, I was left alone, but it wasn't worse than what I had endured before. In the silence of that house, I finally began to think about my future. It didn't mean the pain disappeared immediately. Each new day was a struggle, but I gradually understood that this betrayal wasn't the end. It was a chance to start anew. I decided to do the things I had long postponed. I focused on my health, started running every morning. Physical activity helped me release some of the anger that had built up inside me. I also enrolled in courses I had always wanted to take. These were things I had always planned to do, but kept finding excuses to delay. Now, I delayed nothing. One day, I wrote a letter to myself. In it, I poured out all my pain, all my anger. But I also wrote that this was only temporary. I wrote that this trial would make me stronger. And you know what? It truly did. Now, I look back on everything that happened as a lesson. This experience broke me, but it also opened my eyes. Now I know what it means to value myself and my boundaries. I will never let anyone treat me like that again. I'll end this story with the words that have become my motto. Sometimes betrayal destroys you, but it can also become a starting point. You can't change the past, but you can decide who you'll become tomorrow. And though this path is hard, it always leads to light.